last video, I talked about what existentialism is, just kind of giving a broad overview of subjectivity, and then the profoundness of our responsibility. Not only are we responsible for ourselves, but we are responsible for everyone else, which is terrifying. So what happens when we realize the consequences of this responsibility? What happens when we realize, oh my gosh, not only am I responsible for myself, but I'm responsible for the rest of humanity, and I didn't even choose this. I didn't choose to exist. I didn't choose to be responsible. So there are two major consequences or implications of our responsibility, being anguish and abandonment. So I think the terms sound a little bit more depressing than they actually are. This is something we all experience to differing degrees at different times in our life, but it's just part of the human condition. So the first implication is anguish. We feel this angst, we feel this anxiety about making profound and intense decisions in our lives. I feel anxiety about making even minor decisions all the time, like what am I going to cook for dinner? Where am I going to go eat for dinner? What am I going to teach in my philosophy courses, right? That's a major decision or a major choice. But it's when we realize that our actions not only impact ourselves, but they impact everyone else. And so we feel like we are not deserving of our choices impacting everyone. We don't feel like we have that type of authority for our choices to impact everyone else. So we feel this anguish. We want to ignore it sometimes and say, you know what, my actions don't impact other people, or you know what, I'm just going to ignore this and not make a choice, or I'm going to do something that I know is bad, but I don't think anyone else should do it. So when we do this, when we hide and ignore our anguish and our responsibility from ourselves and our free will from ourselves, we are living in bad faith. So what is bad faith? Bad faith is when we are being hypocritical and we're saying that, oh, you know what, I know this action is bad, but it's okay for me to do this, but it's not okay for anyone else to do this. So think about it with someone who's cheating on their spouse, right? They might say, well, you know what, I don't want my spouse to cheat on me. I don't want to live in a world where everyone is cheating on everyone, but it's okay for me to cheat because, oh, my partner was ignoring me, or my partner yelled at me, or whatever the situation is. But it's when we are hiding and making excuses for our bad conscience, and we're saying that, well, my actions don't impact everyone else, they just impact me, so it's okay for me to do this. It's also when we say things like, well, my destiny has been figured out, so I don't have to make choices, I don't have to define myself, or I'm not responsible for my passions, this is just who I am, I'm an angry person. Those are other examples of bad faith. And so we have to transcend bad faith. We can't let bad faith prevent us from living to our fullest potential, to living up to our subjectivity. And so if in order to get out of that box of bad faith, we have to ask ourselves, what would happen if everyone did what I was doing? What would happen if everyone was doing what I am doing? That is a scary thought for most of us, because we don't necessarily want people to do what we're doing. And oftentimes if we say, well, you know what, I'm terrified of this, I don't want people to do what I'm doing because I'm living kind of a shady life, or, you know, I'm not nice to people, then we're probably living in bad faith and we need to change things up. And we need to really examine ourselves and think, okay, you know what, I need to change myself, I need to change my life. So if you do feel okay about it, if you feel like, you know what, I'm living a pretty ethical life, I'm really happy with who I am, I'm happy with who I've become, I am comfortable with my decisions, affirming the value of this choice to the rest of humanity, then you're probably doing well. Then you're probably living in good faith, which means that you are fully embracing your free will and you're really thinking through your actions. So this is anguish then. It's this angst, it's this anxiety, but it's not something that prevents us from acting. We still make choices. We just do it with this reflection, with this contemplation. And so Sartre uses the example of a general in the army who has to make a very difficult choice. His choice can basically impact the lives of thousands of people. Thousands of people could die from this one person's choice. So what do? Does she not make a decision then? Because, well, you know what, this is a scary decision, this is a scary choice, and I don't want to do anything. No, she still acts. So it's not as if anguish prevents us from acting. It's not as if it makes us inactive. We are still making choices. We are still making decisions, and very profound and important decisions. But it's when we have that extra layer of contemplation and we realize, you know what, who is my action impacting? How is it going to impact me? How is it going to impact people in the future? So that is what anguish is. It's just a condition of our action. It helps us be more reflective about the decisions and the choices we're making. It helps us realize, you know what? I need to really think about how this is impacting other people. So that is the first major implication of our responsibility. The second major implication of our responsibility is abandonment. And so that also sounds scary, but it's basically this idea that God doesn't exist from the atheistic perspective. So if God doesn't exist, this means that I have to define myself. I can't turn to God. I can't turn to the Bible, the Torah, the Quran, the Mahabharata. I can't turn to anything. I have to figure it all out, and that is terrifying. But it's similar to how we feel abandoned perhaps when we first move out of our parents' or family's home and we have to make all these decisions. Or maybe it's the abandonment you feel when you have to figure out, well, what college am I going to go to? What career am I going to go into? What major do I have to decide? Because there's no one else telling us what to do. We have to figure all of this out. So it's just another condition of our action. And abandonment also captures this idea from Dostoevsky, who was a Russian existentialist novelist. You might have heard of his work, Crime and Punishment. And Dostoevsky basically says, we are condemned to be free. And we have all of these possibilities because we are condemned to be free. So what does it mean to be condemned to be free? Well, we didn't choose to exist in the first place. We didn't choose to be free, and we can't escape this freedom. So it is like being condemned. But the irony is that we're condemned to freedom? That doesn't make sense, but that is kind of the irony of our existence. That is the irony of the human condition. We're thrown into this world, we have this free will, we can define ourselves, but we're condemned to this freedom. And that's scary because we don't want to feel like, oh my gosh, if I screw up, it's all my fault. But in fact, it is. So we feel abandoned. And as Dostoevsky had said in another quote, if God does not exist, that means everything is permissible because we don't have a God or a specific moral code to turn to. We have to figure it all out on our own, which is why everything is permissible and which is why we're condemned to be free. And we have to figure out this freedom and embrace this freedom and not ignore it. And so Sartre uses the example of a student of his who had a moral dilemma, and he uses this to illustrate how abandonment feels like. So one of his students had asked him for advice. He had two very different dilemmas here. One of the actions he could have engaged in was to join the French resistance and engage in this duty he felt for his country, which is more of an abstract duty. It's more of kind of a long-term duty. The other decision or the other choice that he had to make was he had to stay with his mom. Should he stay with his mom because he's the only one who can take care of her and she's all on her own? So he has these conflicting duties, one to his country, one to his family. And so he asked Sartre, his existentialist professor, for advice. Now, what does Sartre say? Sartre doesn't really say anything. He says that you are free, so choose, invent your own code. There are no signs in this world. So he's basically telling the student that, you know what, you need to figure this out. I can't give you advice. I can't tell you what to do. I can't tell you which is the right path because you have to figure that out. This is your life. There are no signs that have inherent meaning. You are the one who attributes that meaning to those signs in your life, to those seemingly random coincidences. And so this boy then has to figure out in his heart what he wants to do. He's also telling the student that the student made a decision in the first place to ask Sartre, his existentialist professor, for advice. He kind of knew what advice he was going to get. I mean, how many times have you asked someone for advice and you kind of knew what you were going to get from them, but you wanted to kind of feel affirmed or validated in your decision? So you were like, you know what, I'm going to ask this person for advice and they're going to tell me what I want to hear. So that is kind of what this boy is doing. He asks his existentialist professor for advice, and his existentialist professor told him, I can't give you any specific advice. And that makes complete sense. So we already are making a choice when we choose our advisors. And so Sartre also illustrates this notion of abandonment when he talks about the Jesuit priest. So there was this guy and everything was, going really badly for him. He had a heartbreak. He was struggling with alcoholism, and just really bad things were happening to him. So what happens to us when we have all these bad things happen in our lives? we all make different decisions based off of these things, based off of these events. So someone would say, you know what, I'm just going to give up, forget it, or I'm going to commit suicide. I don't know what I'm going to do. But what this Jesuit priest guy did was he realized, maybe the secular life isn't for me. Maybe I should choose a different path. And that's when he chose a religious path of becoming a Jesuit priest. So we are responsible for our interpretations of these signs in our life, because we interpret things very differently from one another. And so it's not as if these events in our lives have an inherent meaning. It's on us to attribute meaning to these events in our lives. And so we are responsible then for these interpretations. So the Jesuit priest, his case illustrates abandonment because he is choosing who he is. He's not turning to anyone. He's choosing a specific path. He's choosing how he interprets his path. He's choosing how he interprets these signs. And it also illustrates despair. If we experience despair, that doesn't mean we're depressed and we're nihilistic and we just give up on everything, but it does mean that we are living without hope. So everything is so unpredictable in life. We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. We don't know what's going to happen 10 years from now. So we have to live with the sense of, you know what? I don't know what's going to happen. Life is unpredictable. That's what it means to live without hope. You can try to do everything in your power to try to make something happen. So to try to get a specific degree, get married, learn a new trade or learn a new skill. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to work out in the way you want it to work out. So does one just give up then because we don't know what's going to happen? No, you don't give up. You still act, because what matters for existentialists? Actions. Actions are the only things that define reality. So we're still acting, we're still making choices, we're still embracing our subjectivity, but we're doing it with a sense of despair, meaning that we don't necessarily know what's going to happen. We don't know whether what we want to have happen will actually happen. So that is what it means to live with a sense of anguish and abandonment and despair. And so we have to be able to commit ourselves to principles without any illusions. Many of us are committed to things, whether it's a specific religion, spirituality, political party, political principles, whatever it is. And so Sartre says we must commit ourselves without any illusions. We can't assume that what we want to have happen will actually happen. Sartre himself was a Marxist, and he says, will the abolition of private property ever happen in my lifetime? I don't know if it will, but that doesn't mean that I won't try to make that happen throughout my lifetime. So that was his example of living with despair and committing himself to something without any illusions. And so here he's saying, you know what? To all the haters of existentialism, this is not quietism and inaction. This is action, because what matters? Reality. What constitutes reality? Our actions. So this philosophy is the opposite of depression and inaction and nihilism. You're still acting, you're still doing things, but you're doing it with a stern optimism. It's optimistic because you define who you are, you define your life, you get to make all these choices, but it's stern because we have to deal with the consequences of these choices. We can't turn to anyone or anything. We have to figure it all out. So we are nothing other than what our own project is, nothing other than what we project towards the world. We are always transcending our present condition. To be human is to transcend, to go beyond. And so this is how Sartre explains the main principles of existentialism, and the first half of existentialism is humanism.